In the spring of 1987, Harlan County, Kentucky recorded its driest March in 61 years. The creeks ran thin as thread. The topsoil cracked along the ridgelines like old porcelain, and the county extension office sent out a single-page notice: it was into this particular season, into this particular county, into this particular silence that settled over the hills like something old and tired, that a man named Eldon Marsh drove his 1971 Ford pickup down Route 9 and turned onto a gravel road that most people in town had stopped paying attention to years ago. Eldon was 54 years old, though people who met him usually guessed older. He had the kind of face that had been worked on by the sun and the wind for so long that it no longer seemed to change with the seasons. His hands were white and brown and permanently creased with soil that no amount of washing could fully remove. He wore the same canvas jacket he had worn for 11 winters, a dark green thing with a broken zipper at the collar that he kept fastened with a small safety pin his wife Ruth had put there before she passed. He drove slowly, not from caution but from habit, the way a man drives when he has learned that arriving quickly rarely changes anything worth changing. The land he turned onto was 83 acres of the worst-looking ground in the county. Everybody knew it. Everybody said so. The property had belonged to a man named Dale Combs, who had farmed it into exhaustion through the 1970s, growing the same hybrid corn year after year without rotation, without cover cropping, without any particular attention to what the soil might need as opposed to what it could be forced to give. When Dale's health gave out in 1983, his son Ricky had leased it to a cattle operation that had overgrazed the lower fields until the grass gave way to bare compacted clay. The cattle operation folded. Ricky moved to Lexington. The land sat. For 4 years it sat, and in that time it seemed to pull into itself, to go gray and closed and unwelcoming, the way a face does when it has been disappointed too many times. The barn on the property was a board and batten structure that leaned 5 degrees to the east and had a roof with 3 visible holes in it. The farmhouse needed new windows, a new porch floor, and according to the county inspector, a new well pump. The fences along the road had rusted and buckled at the corners. The fields themselves, all 83 acres, were a patchwork of pale clay and dead thistle and old corn stubble that had never been properly turned under. Eldon Marsh paid $41,000 for all of it. He paid cash, which he had saved over 22 years of working as a soil technician for the state agricultural department. He had driven around this county and every county surrounding it testing dirt, reading dirt, learning the language that dirt speaks when it is healthy and the different language it speaks when it has been used without being replenished. He had written reports that nobody read and filed recommendations that nobody followed and watched farm after farm slowly lose the thing that made it a farm, which was not the barn or the tractor or the seed account at the co-op, but the living biology of the ground itself. When Eldon retired from the state job in February of 1987, he had a pension that would cover his basic needs and $41,000 in a savings account and a very clear idea of what he intended to do with both. He intended to bring that broken ground back. The men at the Harlan Feed and Supply on Main Street heard about the sale within a week. In a town of 3,200 people, news of that kind traveled the way weather traveled, which was to say it arrived before you thought it was coming and found you whether you were looking for it or not. Old Marsh bought the Combs place, said a man named Buddy Stratton, who leaned against the counter every Tuesday and Thursday morning with a coffee that he nursed for 2 hours. The whole 83. Lord, said the man behind the counter, whose name was Pete Hazel and who had been selling feed and seed in that building for 30 years. What's he figure to do with it? Farm it, supposedly. Pete Hazel looked up from the invoice he was writing. Farm it. That's what I heard. That ground won't grow a decent stand of anything. Dale Combs saw to that. I know it, Buddy said. Ricky Combs couldn't give that place away for 3 years. Marsh must have paid next to nothing for it. This was not accurate, $41,000 was not nothing, but the spirit of the statement reflected how people felt about the land, which was that it was worth approximately what it looked like, which was not much. The conversation that Tuesday morning was representative of conversations that happened all over town in the weeks that followed. At the diner on 2nd Street. At the barber. At the small Methodist church where Eldon occasionally attended Sunday service. People were not cruel about it, not exactly, because Eldon Marsh was known to be a decent man and people in Harlan County were generally decent people. But there was a particular tone that settled into these conversations, a tone of gentle amusement mixed with something close to pity, the way people talk about a good dog that has developed an inexplicable fondness for chasing cars. "He doesn't know what he's gotten himself into," the tone said. Poor old Eldon. What poor old Eldon was doing, that first spring, was not farming. Not in the way the county understood farming, which involved planting something and watching it grow or watching it fail. What Eldon was doing looked, to anyone who drove past on Route 9, like a strange kind of nothing. He was walking. Every morning, before the dew had fully lifted, he walked the property in a slow grid pattern, moving east to west across each field, crouching periodically to take up a handful of soil and work it between his fingers, sometimes lifting it to his nose, sometimes letting it fall and watching how it fell. He carried a small notebook in his shirt pocket and a soil probe, which was a metal rod with a handle that he pushed into the ground at intervals to pull up cores of earth, and he would hold these cores up to the light and examine the layers the way a doctor examines an X-ray, reading what was there and what wasn't. He dug test pits in 6 locations across the property. He sent soil samples to the state lab in Frankfurt. He spent 3 evenings at the county library reading the agricultural census records that went back to 1940, tracing what the land had grown and when and what had been applied to it. He found records of a period in the 1950s, under the ownership of a man named August Combs, Dale's father, when the land had been in a 4-year rotation of corn, wheat, clover, and fallow, and during those years the yields had been among the highest recorded in the county. He sat with those records for a long time. He drove to Lexington once to meet with a woman named Dr. Sarah Trent at the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, who specialized in soil microbiology. They sat in her office for 3 hours, and he showed her his soil probe cores and his lab results, and she asked him questions and he answered them, and at the end she said, "The biology isn't dead, Mr. Marsh. It's suppressed. There's a difference." "I know there is," he said. "Most people don't. Most people don't look at the soil long enough to find out." Dr. Trent leaned back in her chair. "What are you planning to plant?" "Nothing this year," he said. She nodded slowly. "And compost. And time. Time is the part people skip," she said. "I know it," said Eldon Marsh. He drove back to Harlan County in the late afternoon with the windows down and the green hills rolling past and the air still carrying the cold edge of March, and he felt something he had not felt in years, which was the specific kind of peace that comes when a man is doing exactly the thing he was made to do. That summer he did not plant a cash crop. He planted instead a cover crop mix of crimson clover, winter rye, and hairy vetch across 40 acres of the worst ground, which were the lower fields that the cattle had compacted. The remaining acres he left in a managed fallow, mowing them twice to prevent weed seed production and applying the first of what would be 12 truckloads of composted manure he had arranged to receive from a dairy operation 15 miles east. He repaired the barn roof himself over 3 weekends in June, climbing at an age when most men had decided that roofs were for younger people, moving carefully and methodically, replacing the damaged boards, laying new tin over the worst sections. He fixed the porch floor of the farmhouse with lumber he milled from 2 dead oak trees that stood at the north end of the property. He replaced the well pump in July with the help of his neighbor's teenage boy, a quiet kid named Marcus who came over on Saturdays and didn't say much but worked steadily and seemed to find the whole operation interesting in a way he couldn't quite articulate. When Buddy Stratton drove past on Route 9 in August and saw no crop in those fields, just a low green mat of clover and vetch, he stopped at the feed store that Thursday and reported this observation with a slow shake of his head. "Whole summer gone and not one row of corn," he said. "Not one row of beans. Just some kind of ground cover, looks like." "Cover crop," Pete Hazel said, though he said it in a tone that suggested the distinction was not particularly meaningful. "He's not farming," Buddy said. "He's gardening." This became the word for what Eldon was doing. Gardening. It was said without much malice but with a finality that suggested the matter had been settled, that a man who spent his first year spreading compost and growing clover was not a serious person in the agricultural sense of the word, and that the Combs place would remain the Combs place in character regardless of who had paid $41,000 for it. Eldon was aware of this assessment. He was not unaware of much that happened in town. But he had a quality that was less common than it appeared, which was a genuine indifference to the opinion of people who had not bothered to look at the same information he was looking at. This was not arrogance. He would have changed his approach immediately if someone had presented him with evidence that it was wrong. But clover and vetch and compost in time were not wrong, and he knew they were not wrong, and the opinion of men who had never taken a soil probe in their lives was not evidence of anything except the limits of what they could see. He spent the evenings that fall reading. He had built a small shelf beside the woodstove in the farmhouse, and it held a specific collection: William Albrecht on soil fertility, Edward Faulkner on plowing, Sir Albert Howard on composting, newer papers on mycorrhizal networks and soil carbon sequestration that Dr. Trent had sent him. He read slowly, making notes in the same kind of small notebook he carried in the field. The woodstove ticked and settled. Outside, the first cool nights of October moved across the hills. He thought about Ruth some evenings. Not with grief exactly, because grief had run its long course in the years since she passed, but with a kind of quiet company, the way a man thinks about a person who understood him better than most. She would have liked this place, he thought. She had always liked things that were broken in ways that could be fixed. She had been a practical woman with an unusual capacity for patience, and she had believed, with a certainty that she did not often feel the need to express, that the best things in life required waiting. He thought she would have enjoyed the clover field in August when the crimson blooms had come in and the whole lower pasture had turned a color so red it almost hurt to look at in the afternoon light. He thought she would have said something dry and accurate about the men at the feed store. The second year, 1988, he planted soybeans on 30 acres of the reclaimed ground. Not a commercial seed variety, but an heirloom variety called Richland that had been developed in Ohio in the 1920s and that Eldon had sourced through a seed-saving organization in Indiana. He paid more for that seed than he would have paid for commercial varieties. People at the co-op, when they heard this, treated it as confirmation of what they had suspected, which was that Eldon Marsh was perhaps not in complete possession of his practical senses. He also acquired a tractor that summer, a 1964 John Deere 4020 that he found in a collapsed equipment shed on a farm that had been foreclosed and sold for back taxes. The tractor needed significant work: a new fuel injection pump, new hydraulic seals, a clutch replacement. He did most of this work himself in the barn over the course of 8 weeks, acquiring the parts through a dealer in Corbin and consulting a service manual that he had written away for. The tractor, when it finally ran with the particular authority of an old machine that has been properly rebuilt, a deep sustained power that younger machines sometimes lacked. Marcus, the neighbor's boy, was there the afternoon the 4020 turned over for the first time after the rebuild, and his face did something that it didn't often do, which was split into a wide unguarded grin. "That thing sounds like it means business," the boy said. "It does," Eldon said. "It always did. It just needed someone to listen to what it was telling them." He let Marcus drive it once around the lower field, watching the boy figure out the controls with the methodical seriousness of a 17-year-old who had decided that this moment was important enough to not mess up. Eldon stood at the edge of the field with his arms crossed and watched and felt something that he did not name. The soybeans that year were not remarkable. The yield was decent, not impressive, not the kind of thing that would have drawn comment, but decent, considering the condition of the ground a year prior. More important to Eldon than the yield was what he saw when he dug into the soil after harvest. The tilth had changed. The color had deepened. Where there had been a pale, powdery, almost lifeless structure, there was now a darker, more granular soil that crumbled properly in the hand, that smelled faintly of something alive. He found earthworms in the lower field for the first time, 3 in a single probe hole, which he regarded with a satisfaction disproportionate, perhaps, to the discovery of 3 earthworms, but which he felt nonetheless, because he understood what earthworms meant in a soil that had not had them. It meant the biology was coming back. The third year, 1989, he rotated to winter wheat on the soybean ground and continued his cover cropping on the remaining acreage. He also, that spring, began work on the north field, 22 acres of higher ground that had been the worst of the property, ground so compacted and depleted that the cover crops of the first 2 years had barely established. He deep-tilled this ground once, the only time he used aggressive tillage on any part of the farm, running a subsoil chisel through it to break the hard pan layer that had formed under years of heavy cattle hooves, and then immediately seeded it with a diverse cover mix of 12 species, including radishes that would winter kill and leave channels in the soil, and deep-rooted chicory that would continue to break up the subsoil biologically over time. He spread another 4 loads of compost. He waited. It was in the third year, also, that his situation began to attract a different kind of attention, though not yet from the men at the feed store. Gerald Fitch at First Farmers Bank had occasion to drive past the Combs place, the Marsh place, as some people were beginning to call it, on his way to look at another property, and he slowed down involuntarily, because the fields he was looking at were not the fields he expected. The lower ground, which he had ridden past hundreds of times and which he associated in his memory with bare clay and thistle and the general aesthetic of abandonment, had a different look. It was not yet the look of a productive farm, not yet the look that would make a banker's eyes sharpen with interest, but it was not the look of nothing, either. It was the look of a place that was tending towards something. He mentioned, "I can't say what it is exactly," he said. "The soil looks different. Darker, almost." "Maybe he put something on it," his wife said. "That's what I figure. But I don't know. It looks like it's working." In town, the conversation had not shifted much. Eldon was still a figure of bemused distance, a man doing something that people couldn't quite place in the category of real farming, which in Harlan County meant corn or hay or cattle, and ideally all three. He didn't go to the co-op meetings. He didn't attend the Farm Bureau socials. He bought his supplies quietly, kept his own hours, and was seen periodically at the diner on Wednesday mornings eating eggs and reading something, always something, a notebook open beside his coffee. There was one person in town who had begun to take his operations seriously, and that was Pete Hazel's wife, Margaret, who was a retired schoolteacher and who had a garden of her own and a genuine curiosity about plants and growing things. She had stopped by the farm once in the spring of 1989 on the pretext of returning a borrowed canning pot to Marcus's mother, who lived next door to Eldon, and had found herself standing at the fence of the lower field looking at the cover crop with a feeling she couldn't name. She asked Eldon about it and she smelled it. "That's a living soil," he said. 2 years ago, this ground smelled like concrete. Didn't smell like anything." She looked at the dark handful of earth and then at the long field stretching away in the morning light and then at the old man holding the soil in his wide brown hand, and she thought, this person knows something. She told Pete that evening at dinner. "He knows what he's doing," she said. Pete was quiet for a moment. "Might be," he said eventually. He was a fair man, and he had been watching Eldon's inputs long enough to understand that what was happening on that farm was not random. But there was a momentum to the town's assessment that was hard to interrupt, and Pete was not a man who liked to get out in front of things. The wheat that year was the best indicator yet. Not the yield alone, which was solid if unspectacular, but the quality. The seed heads were full and the protein content, when tested at the elevator, came back higher than average, which the elevator operator, a man named Clay Sutton, noted with mild surprise. "Where'd this come from?" Clay asked when he saw the results. "Marsh Place," said the man who had hauled it. Clay looked at the results again. He had been running that elevator for 19 years, and he knew what Harlan County wheat looked like. This was better than Harlan County wheat. He didn't say anything else about it, but he remembered it. The fourth year was the year things began to be undeniable. Eldon planted corn in 1990 on the lower 40 acres, now completing the rotation cycle he had designed. He used an open-pollinated variety called Reed's Yellow Dent, an older variety that his soil research suggested would perform better in living soil conditions than modern hybrids, which had been bred for performance in high-input, chemically supported ground. He planted it in late April, after the soil temperature had stabilized, and he side-dressed it with a modest amount of nitrogen from a natural source, and he waited. That summer was not a good summer in Harlan County. July came in dry. Then August came in drier. The rainfall deficit by mid-August was 9 inches for the season, and the creek that ran along the county road had dropped to a trickle, and the farmers who had planted corn on the thin ridge ground were watching their stands roll and fire at the edges, the leaves curling inward in the heat of the afternoon like they were trying to disappear. Eldon's corn did not roll. This was not magic. It was not luck. It was the result of 4 years of building soil organic matter, which acted like a sponge in the lower field, holding water that other fields couldn't hold because other fields had lost the biological structure necessary to hold it. It was the result of the deep root channels created by the radishes and chicory. It was the result of the mycorrhizal network that had been quietly re-establishing itself in the soil biology, extending the reach of the corn roots beyond what they could access alone. The corn stood dark and full in August, while crops on either side of Eldon's property line showed the gray-green stress of drought. People driving Route 9 noticed. They couldn't help noticing, because the line was that sharp, that visible, that difficult to explain away. Buddy Stratton stopped his truck on the road one Tuesday afternoon and sat looking at those fields for a full 5 minutes. He didn't say anything to anyone about it right away. He drove on. But he thought about what he'd seen, and he found that he couldn't stop thinking about it, and eventually, on a Thursday morning at the feed store, he said, without preamble, "You seen Marsh's corn?" Pete Hazel had. "Looking decent," Buddy said carefully. "Looking better than decent," Pete said. The two men were quiet for a moment. "In this drought," Buddy said. "In this drought," Pete agreed. Clay Sutton at the elevator saw the corn when it came in that October. The moisture content was right. The test weight was good. The yield, when he ran the numbers, was higher than the county average for the year by a margin that under normal conditions would have been notable and under drought conditions was striking. He called the county extension agent, a young man named Dave Reardon who had been in the position for 2 years and who was earnest and thorough, and told him the numbers. Dave Reardon drove out to the Marsh place the following week. He found Eldon in the barn reorganizing seed storage, the old 4020 parked in the center of the space and the seed bags stacked along the wall in a system that was clearly organized according to some internal logic. The barn smelled of dry wood and dust and the faint mineral scent of good grain. Dave introduced himself and Eldon invited him to sit on a hay bale and offered him coffee from a battered thermos, and they talked for 2 hours. Dave had brought his own notebook. He asked careful questions about the rotation, the cover crop mixes, the compost sources, the tillage decisions, the variety selection. Eldon answered all of it precisely, without exaggeration, and when he didn't know something he said so, which Dave Reardon, who was accustomed to farmers claiming more certainty than they possessed, found refreshing. "Your yields in a drought year," Dave said at one point, looking at his notes. "Can you explain that to me in simple terms?" Eldon thought for a moment. "Soil that's alive holds water," he said. "Soil that's dead doesn't. Most of what we call farming in this county right now is conducted on soil that is somewhere between very sick and dead. When drought comes, those soils fail, because there's nothing in them to buffer the stress. My ground had 4 years of biology building in it. 4 years of roots and organisms and organic matter accumulating. So when August went dry, my soil still had water in it that other soils didn't." Dave wrote this down. "The other thing," Eldon said, "is roots. My cover crop rotations have been building root depth and root channels for 4 years. Those channels get water down deep, to where the corn roots can follow. Most conventionally tilled ground has a compaction layer that roots can't penetrate. Mine doesn't anymore." Dave looked up from his notebook. "How long have you known all this?" 22 years, Eldon said. "I wrote reports about it for the state. Nobody read them." Dave was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you be willing to present this at the winter farm meeting? The extension office meeting in January?" Eldon looked at him steadily. "If you think it would be useful." "I think it would be very useful," Dave said. The meeting was held in the community room of the Harlan County Library on the second Thursday of January 1991. Dave Reardon had promoted it through the extension newsletter and by word of mouth, and he had expected perhaps 40 or 50 people. 73 farmers showed up, which was the largest attendance at a county extension meeting in 11 years. Eldon stood at the front of the room in his canvas jacket with the safety pin at the collar and talked for 40 minutes without notes, because he did not need notes for things he had known for 22 years. He talked about soil biology. He talked about cover crops and compost and rotation and the water-holding capacity of organic matter. He talked about the Combs place, about what it had looked like when he bought it and what it looked like now, and he talked about the numbers, the yields, the drought performance, the soil test results that showed organic matter rising from 0.8% when he arrived to 2.6% in the lower fields after 4 years. He talked about patience, which was not a romantic concept in his telling but a practical one, a matter of understanding that soil biology operates on its own schedule and will not be rushed by human impatience, and that the farmers who tried to substitute chemicals for that biology were borrowing against a future that would eventually come due. He talked about his wife Ruth, briefly, unexpectedly, in a way that surprised him as much as anyone in the room. He said that she had been the one who taught him that the most important things could not be seen in a single season, that you had to watch something across years to understand what it was becoming rather than only what it was. He said this and then he stopped and looked at the table for a moment, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something true and private has been said in them. When he finished, nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then a man in the third row named Howard Bledsoe, who had farmed 600 acres of ridge ground for 30 years and who had never in those 30 years attended an extension meeting, raised his hand and said, "What do I plant first?" And the room came alive. There were questions for another hour. Specific questions, practical questions, the questions of people who had been farming their whole lives and who recognized, some of them slowly and some all at once, that they were hearing something that changed the shape of what they thought they knew. Pete Hazel, who was in the back row, did not ask a question, but he wrote something in the margin of his program, and later his wife Margaret, who had somehow known all along, would see what he wrote, which was simply, he was right. Gerald Fitch was also there. He sat to one side and said nothing during the question period, but he stayed afterward when most people had gone, and he approached Eldon at the front of the room where Eldon was folding the map he had used to show his field layout. "Mr. Marsh," Gerald said, "I want to apologize." Eldon looked at him without particular expression. "For what?" "I was one of the people who thought you'd made a mistake. Buying that ground. Doing what you did with it." Eldon folded the last corner of the map. "I know you were." Gerald Fitch had the good grace to look directly at him. "I was wrong." "You were looking at the surface," Eldon said, without unkindness. "Most people do." He picked up his thermos and his notebook and put on his hat and walked out into the January cold, past the parked trucks and the last few farmers still standing in clusters in the parking lot talking about root depth and compost ratios and cover crop mixes with an animation that none of them had expected to feel that evening, and he got into the 1971 Ford and drove out onto the county road and turned south toward Route 9 and toward home. The fields on either side of the road were frozen and still in the way that January fields are still, the surface sealed under a thin layer of frost, the dark furrows of fall tillage visible under the white. He drove past them slowly, the way he always drove, watching the land the way he had watched it for more than 2 decades, reading it, thinking about what it held and what it had lost and what, given enough care and enough time, it might become. When he turned into his own gravel road, the headlights swept across the lower field and he could see nothing in the dark, but he knew what was under that frozen surface. He knew the fungal threads extending through the soil matrix. He knew the bacteria cycling nutrients through the organic matter. He knew the earthworms consolidated in their winter dormancy, 23 species where there had been none. He knew the root channels reaching 4 feet down into subsoil that had once been compacted hard as pavement. He parked in front of the barn and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. He thought about the spring. He thought about the North Field, which was in only its second full year of recovery and which still had 3 or 4 years of building ahead before it would perform the way the lower fields performed. He thought about the next rotation cycle, which he had already planned on paper. He thought about Marcus, who had come to him 2 weeks ago and said, with the careful directness of a 19-year-old who has rehearsed a conversation, that he wanted to learn to farm and wanted to know if Eldon would teach him. Eldon had said yes without hesitation. He thought about the 83 acres under the January frost. He thought about what they had been and what they were becoming. He thought about how the county extension agent had said, during the drive back from the elevator in October, that the Marsh place was the most dramatic soil recovery he had seen in 5 years of work, and how Eldon had said, simply, that it wasn't dramatic at all, that it was just what the soil did when you let it. He got out of the truck and walked to the barn to check the water heater for the stock he didn't yet have but planned for in the spring, and the cold air came off the fields around him, clean and deep and faintly mineral, the smell of ground that had things happening in it that the cold could slow but not stop. He stood at the barn door for a moment, looking out at the dark fields. There was no wind. The stars were sharp and low in the way they get in January when the air has been scoured clean. The fence line he had rebuilt ran straight along the road, and the barn roof he had patched himself stood solid against the sky, and the fields his soil probe had mapped and his cover crops had healed and his 4 years of patience had transformed lay around him in the dark, 83 acres of ground that everyone had written off and that he had simply refused to stop believing in. He thought about something August Combs had done 70 years ago, rotating and resting and tending the ground with the care of a man who understood that a farm was not a machine to be run until it broke but a living system to be partnered with, and how that understanding had been lost over the decades that followed, and how it was not too late to find it again. He thought about Ruth, who had placed the safety pin at his collar on a Tuesday morning 11 years ago and said, "That zipper's not going to fix itself," and how she had been right about most things. He turned and went into the barn and checked the heater and made sure the water was running and came back out and latched the door and walked to the farmhouse through the cold. Behind him, in the dark, the soil breathed its slow winter breath, the billion invisible organisms tending their work in the frozen ground, doing what they had always done, doing what they would do in the spring with a patience that made human patience look like nothing at all, building what had been broken, returning what had been taken, quiet and inexorable as time itself. By the spring of 1993, 14 farmers in Harlan County had begun cover crop programs. Dave Reardon had written a report that was cited in the State Extension Bulletin. Marcus farmed the North Field independently under a lease arrangement and was, at 21, the youngest farmer in the county running a certified soil health operation. The Combs place had a new name by then. Not officially, not on any deed or county map, but in the way that mattered, which was in the way people referred to it in conversation. At the feed store, at the diner, at the Farm Bureau meeting that Eldon did eventually start attending, they called it what the fields themselves had earned the right to be called. They called it the Marsh Place. And they said it differently than they had before, with a weight and a respect in the word that was not about a man who had bought bad ground for a low price, but about a man who had understood something that the rest of them were only beginning to learn. The land doesn't forget what it's given, Eldon told Marcus that spring, kneeling in the upper corner of the north field with a handful of dark soil between his fingers. It just needs someone patient enough to give it. Marcus looked at the soil and then at the field and then at the old man beside him, and he nodded, and he reached down and took up his own handful, and he held it and felt it the way he had seen Eldon hold it 100 times, with the full attention of someone learning to read a language older than any language he had been taught. The morning light moved across the hills. The fields ran long and dark and full of life in every direction. Somewhere down the fence line a meadowlark sang its single bright note into the still spring air. Eldon Marsh rose slowly to his feet and looked out over the 83 acres, and what he felt in that moment was not triumph and not vindication, though he had earned both. What he felt was something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. He put the soil in his pocket. He picked up his notebook. He walked on.